What do you call a pile of kittens?
What?
A meowton.
Lay. Okay, well this one's actually funny. I got my best friend a fridge for his birthday. I can't wait to see his face light up when he opens it.
Is that the joke?
It was a joke because the fridge like lights
Oh,
up
gosh.
inside when you open it. I stayed up all night looking for the sun, and then it dawned on me. I wish somebody else would have found these jokes for me.
Beep, 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 beep. What did the cheese say when he was playing basketball?
What?
Swiss.
Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Billy. I'm the student pastor over at the Frederick campus. I'm sure most of you are wondering, is the other guy's name is Billy? Yes, it is. There are two of us on staff on the student ministry team, and we are super excited that you guys are a part of our small groups. And we're jumping into a new section tonight. Last week, we talked about Matthew chapter 9 and just the excitement that swells up inside of us when we realize what Jesus has done in our lives. We just can't contain it. We have to tell someone. And tonight, we're talking about Matthew chapter 18. But before we get to that, I want to ask you guys a couple questions. I'm sure some of you are like me. Does anybody lose their phone or their wallet or their keys or something of importance? Because I do it all the time. All the time. I lose my phone the most, which is crazy because I always have it. But I always lose it, and I'm always spending like an hour of my day looking for it. And it's like, well, this is what I'm gonna be doing for the rest of my life. I'm gonna be looking for this phone. And then it's like, I spent an hour looking for it. I can't give up now. I've gotta keep going. And then you're like, I'm gonna give up. And then you go and walk into this room you pretty sure haven't been in the last 8 months. You're like, there's my phone. I'm gonna take that. That's mine. And I don't know if any of you guys are like this. I do it with my wallet. I do it with my keys. I do it with my phone. But I think Jesus in Matthew chapter 18 has a really similar feeling. And in fact, at the beginning of the chapter, here's what we're going to talk about. At the beginning of the chapter, Jesus is sitting down with his disciples. And his disciples ask this question to Jesus. They go, Jesus, tell us who the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is. And hey, Jesus, we want, basically what they're asking is like, hey, are we going to be included in the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus, sitting down, sees a couple of children wandering around. He says, hey, come to me. He invites one of them to come sit with him. And Jesus says, children are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And you're probably wondering, like, that feels a little, like, backwards. And it is, and especially in the first century, it feels really, really backwards. Because in the first century, here's what you need to know about kids. In the first century, they were parasites. Kids had no value to society. They didn't work. They didn't help out around the house. They ate the food. They took up time, energy, effort. So when Jesus says this, the disciples are probably losing their minds. Like, what? I can't believe that you would say children are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. There's no way. There's no way that children are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. In fact, what Jesus is saying here is the kingdom is so backwards. The least of these are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on to compare us to sheep. And this is where we're landing in verse 12. He compares us to sheep in verse 12. This is what he says. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 and go out and search for the one that is lost? And if he finds it, I tell you the truth, he will rejoice over it more than the 99 who didn't wander away. In the same way, it is not my heavenly Father's will that any one of these little ones should perish. And this is what Jesus is saying. He says, even like the least of these are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Here's what we know about sheep. Sheep are some of the dumbest creatures on the face of the planet. They're so dumb. They'll just walk off cliffs. They'll just wander away. They're pretty dumb. And Jesus often compares us to sheep. Which is, yeah, okay, Jesus, I'm pretty dumb sometimes. Yeah, I get that. And this is what the shepherd would do when one of the 99 would leave and wander away. When he'd find it, they were like professionals. Like, shepherds were amazing at finding their sheep. So when one would wander away, they'd like scale rocks, they'd go into caves, they'd do whatever they had to do to bring this one sheep back. And in the same way, Jesus does us with this. Jesus goes out of his way to find us. Even those in the kingdom who are the least of these. There are people probably you think that shouldn't be a part of the kingdom of heaven. There are people that you probably think shouldn't be a part of church or shouldn't know Jesus. But here's what we know about from Matthew chapter 18 and Luke chapter 15. Jesus values even the least of these. He values even the least of these. Those that we have deemed and those that we have labeled are unworthy. The outcasts in society. Here's my encouragement, man, that we go and help seek those who are lost, because Jesus will rejoice so much when they're brought into the kingdom of heaven. I want to encourage you, just because someone's different or you've labeled them as an outcast does not mean that they don't get to be a part of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says so much that sheep and children are some of the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So I want to challenge you. For those of you who do know Jesus, just piggybacking of what we chatted about with Matthew chapter 9 last week, you can't contain and you can't, it just swells up inside of you for what Jesus has done in your life, the hope that he's given, the rescue that you received, the grace and the mercy that you are so undeserving of. How can we keep that inside of us when there are people who don't know Jesus? When there are people who don't know who he is? And Jesus rejoices so much when the one is brought into the kingdom. And for those of you who don't know Jesus, man, what a great opportunity you have in this small group to ask the questions that maybe that you're uncomfortable asking. Maybe it's exploring and being part of a Christian community. Maybe it's just being around other people who do know Jesus. But I want to encourage you. Don't write off people just because you've labeled them something as outcasts, as unworthy. Because even they are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I'm going to get ready to dive into our small groups. We'll see you next week.